The fold space event registered on Klingon Defense Force long-range sensors as nothing recognizable. Not a warp signature. Not a cloaking device powering down. Not the gravitational ripple of a vessel dropping from transwarp. The sensor operators aboard the orbital defense platform Destruction's Hand had served the Empire for a combined 80 years, and not one of them had a designation for what their instruments were screaming at them in the 43 seconds before the sky above Qo'noS tore open. It began as a luminescent fracture. A line of impossible light drawn across the upper atmosphere like a blade dragged across black silk, widening at both ends simultaneously, bleeding colors that had no business existing in normal space, deep ultraviolet bleeding into something beyond the visible spectrum that made the eyes water and the hindbrain recoil. The tear expanded across 900 kilometers of atmosphere in less than a minute, and through it came something vast. The Heighliner was the size of a small moon. Even breaching dimensional barriers, even coming apart at its structural seams as the fold space energies that had sustained it collapsed catastrophically, its sheer tonnage was staggering. It entered Qo'noS's gravitational envelope nose first, its hull already fracturing along 17 primary stress lines, the navigator's chamber in the forward section rupturing and venting a cloud of spice-saturated atmosphere that would later drift down into the upper ionosphere as a faint orange haze that Klingon meteorologists would spend 3 weeks failing to explain. The vessel did not fall so much as it disintegrated in a controlled cascade, its cargo bays splitting open like the chambers of a cracked rib cage, and from those bays, as the ship burned and the sky screamed and the orbital defense platform scrambled their interceptor wings in pure reflexive confusion, something was released. Not debris. Not escape pods. Not the automated distress signals of a dying civilian vessel. Landers. Drop-capable assault carriers, angular and brutal in their design, built for exactly this, for the chaos of arrival under fire, for the violence of atmospheric entry, for the first terrible minutes of an invasion when everything is burning and uncertain and the only thing that matters is putting soldiers on the ground. 41 of them punched through the burning wreckage of the Heighliner's lower hull and angled toward the northern continent of Qo'noS with the mechanical indifference of weapons that had already been aimed before anyone on the ground knew to be afraid. If you want to see more crossover battles that pit the galaxy's greatest warrior cultures against each other, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments, tell us who you want to see invade next. May the Force be with you. On the orbital platform, Commander Kor'vakh transmitted to the High Council with the clipped urgency of a man who understood that whatever was happening, it had already moved beyond his ability to stop. His words were simple. 41 landing craft. Northern continent. No identification. No response to hails on any frequency. The Chancellor's response was equally simple. Destroy them. The interceptor wings tried. Sardaukar anti-air capability was not something the Klingon Defense Force had intelligence on, because no intelligence on Sardaukar military hardware existed in this galaxy. The interceptors came in fast and aggressive, as Klingon pilots always did, expecting the landers to be vulnerable in their descent phase, slow, committed to their trajectory, unable to maneuver. Instead they found that each lander carried point defense systems of a design that operated on principles that Klingon engineers would later describe as technically impossible, firing energy pulses in overlapping fields that turned the intercept corridor into a killing ground. 6 birds of prey were destroyed in 90 seconds. The remaining interceptors pulled back. The landers continued their descent. They touched down in the Kor'vakh basin, a broad flat expanse of volcanic rock 200 kilometers north of the first city, chosen with the kind of tactical precision that suggested whoever was aboard those craft had assessed the terrain from orbit and selected their landing zone in the time it took the Defense Force to scramble its response. The ramps came down. The Sardaukar walked out into Klingon air for the first time, and the world they found was gray and cold and smelled of iron and sulfur, and to men and women who had been forged in the hell of Salusa Secundus, it felt almost familiar. Colonel-Bashar Zoomkaran stood at the edge of his command lander's ramp and looked at the horizon. He was a tall man, broad through the chest and shoulders, his Sardaukar uniform immaculate despite the chaos of the crossing. His face was the face of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to process catastrophe without allowing it to alter his next decision. The dimensional breach. The Heighliner's destruction. The loss of contact with the Imperium. He had processed all of it in the 40 minutes of atmospheric descent, and he had arrived at the only conclusion that a Sardaukar officer was trained to arrive at when cut off from command and deposited on an unknown world with an intact fighting force. Assess. Secure. Dominate. He had 8,000 soldiers. He had ammunition, rations, and equipment for a sustained campaign. He had no way home, because the navigator was dead and the Heighliner was debris field and the fold space technology that had brought them here had died with the vessel. Those were the facts. The Colonel-Bashar filed them away and turned to his Burseg, a compact woman named Shira whose combat record was the kind that made other soldiers speak quietly. Defensive perimeter. 3 kilometers. I want sensor outposts on every elevation within visual range. He looked at the sky, where the burning remnants of the Heighliner were still streaking through the upper atmosphere like orange comets. And find me whatever passes for a communication network on this planet. I want to know who owns this world before they come to tell us themselves. They came within 4 hours. 3 full battalions of Klingon ground forces, transported in by troop carrier, deploying in the aggressive forward posture that was the Defense Force's default tactical doctrine. Their commander, a general named Kor'vakh, had fought in the Dominion War and had faced Jem'Hadar, and he looked at the Sardaukar defensive position with the professional assessment of a soldier who had seen elite troops before. What he had not seen was this. The perimeter Zumkaran's forces had constructed in 4 hours was not a field position. It was a fortress. And the soldiers manning it stood with a stillness that Kor'vakh, despite himself, found unsettling. Not the stillness of fear. The stillness of absolute certainty. He hailed them. No response. He issued a formal demand of surrender in the name of Chancellor Gowron and the Klingon Empire. No response. He gave the order to advance, because he was a Klingon general and there was no other order available to him, and his battalions moved forward with the ferocity that had broken Dominion lines on a dozen worlds. The Sardaukar opened fire with a precision that was almost contemptuous. Not the wild aggression of troops eager for blood. The measured, economical violence of soldiers who had calculated exactly how many shots were needed and were not interested in exceeding that number. The first Klingon line collapsed in under 3 minutes. The second line pushed through the fallen and kept coming, because Klingon always kept coming, and the Sardaukar adjusted their fire and broke that line too. Kor'vakh died in the 7th minute, leading a charge that would have broken almost any opponent he had ever faced. It did not break the Sardaukar. By the time the surviving Klingon forces pulled back, they had inflicted casualties on the Sardaukar perimeter, 17 dead, 23 wounded. They had lost 412 of their own. In the first city, the High Council received the battle report in silence. Chancellor Gowron, seated at the head of the great table, read the numbers twice. Then he read them a third time, because the first 2 readings had not made them make sense, and he was a man who believed that numbers, given sufficient attention, would eventually submit to reason. They did not submit. The numbers were what they were. Something had landed on Qo'noS. Something that could fight. The High Council chamber had stood for 6 centuries. Its walls had absorbed the declarations of war against the Federation, the Romulans, the Cardassians. It had heard death sentences pronounced and alliances forged and broken and forged again in the particular rhythm of Klingon politics, which resembled nothing so much as a controlled avalanche, always moving, always destroying something, always somehow arriving at a destination that looked, in retrospect, almost intentional. The chamber had heard a great many things. It had never heard what it heard now, which was silence. Genuine, unbroken silence, from men and women who had built entire careers on never being the one who stopped talking first. Gowron broke it, because Gowron always broke silences. It was one of the things that had made him Chancellor and one of the things that made him dangerous, this inability to allow a vacuum to persist without filling it with his will. 400 warriors, he said. The words were not a question. They were a weight he was placing on the table for the council to feel. 400 warriors, 3 battalions, against 8,000 of whatever these things are, and we lost 400 in 7 minutes. The numbers are confirmed, said General Martok, who was attending the session via subspace from his post near the Romulan border and whose face on the view screen carried the particular expression of a man who was angry at information for existing. Torath was a capable officer. His battalions were combat seasoned. Dominion War veterans, most of them. Then they were not the problem, said Councillor Duras, the surviving branch of that house, always present, always reading the room for opportunity. The problem is whatever came out of those landers. We have preliminary analysis from the sensor sweeps conducted during the engagement, said the Defense Force's chief intelligence officer, a lean, scarred man named Krell who had spent 30 years being right about things that people wished he was wrong about. He activated the chamber's central display, and the holographic battlefield reconstruction assembled itself above the council table, the Sardaukar perimeter rendered in amber light, the Klingon assault lines in green, and the casualty progression mapped in a red that spread with nauseating speed. They are humanoid. Bipedal, approximately standard size, no visible augmentation that our sensors can identify. No energy shields. No exoskeletal armor beyond what appears to be a form of ballistic-resistant fabric and ceramic plating. He paused. They defeated 3 Klingon battalions through superior tactical positioning, coordinated fire discipline, and what our analysts are describing as an almost complete absence of hesitation in their decision-making cycle. Explain that, Gowron said. In combat, even elite soldiers experience microdelays. The moment between perceiving a threat and responding to it. Our Dominion War data suggests that Jem'Hadar have an unusually short decision cycle. It contributed significantly to their effectiveness. These soldiers, Krell gestured at the amber markers, appear to have an even shorter one. They are not faster than our warriors in terms of raw physical speed. They are faster in the space between thought and action. It is as though they have removed something from the process. Fear, said a voice from the chamber entrance, and every head turned. Worf had not been announced. He had arrived on Qo'noS 3 hours after the battle in the Kor'vakh basin, recalled from Deep Space Nine on Martok's personal authority, and he had spent those 3 hours in the Defense Force Intelligence Center reviewing every scrap of sensor data from the engagement before coming to the Council. He walked to the center of the chamber with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that Klingon politics rewarded the appearance of certainty even when certainty was the one thing you did not have. He was wearing his Starfleet uniform, which was a choice that never failed to generate a particular quality of tension in this room. They have removed fear, Worf said. That is what the data shows. It is not that they do not feel it. It is that they have been trained, from childhood, in an environment so brutal and so deliberately designed to kill them, that fear has been reduced to a piece of information rather than an experience. They process it. They act on the useful parts of it. They discard the rest. He looked at the holographic display. This is not augmentation. This is conditioning. Whoever made these soldiers spent generations making them. And you know this how? Councillor Duras asked, with the particular inflection that implied the question was not about information. Because Starfleet intelligence has been analyzing the sensor data since the breach event was detected, and because I have fought enough different kinds of soldiers to recognize the difference between a warrior who is not afraid and a warrior who has been engineered to process fear differently. Worf turned to face Gowron directly. Chancellor, I am requesting permission to address the Council on tactical recommendations. Gowron studied him with those wide, intense eyes that had always been his most unsettling feature. You have come a long way to make recommendations, son of Mok. I have come because Martok asked me to, and because what landed in the Kor'vakh basin is not a problem that can be solved by sending more battalions to do what 3 battalions already failed to do. The silence that followed was different from the first silence. This one had an edge to it. "You suggest we do not fight," said General Kalotha's nephew, a young counselor named Drath who had inherited his uncle's seat and approximately a fifth of his uncle's intelligence. "I suggest we do not fight the same way," Worf said, and his voice carried the specific patience of a man explaining something to someone he has already decided is not going to understand it, but who must be addressed anyway for political reasons. "What these soldiers are trained for is direct engagement. Overwhelming force, disciplined fire, coordinated assault. They have spent their lives being thrown against every kind of direct threat their makers could devise. That is their environment. That is where they are strongest." He looked around the chamber. The Kor'vakh basin engagement was fought entirely on their terms. 3 battalions advancing across open ground against a prepared defensive position. We gave them exactly what they were built to destroy. "Then what do you propose?" Gowron asked. "Information, first. We know almost nothing about them. We do not know their logistics chain, their command structure, their supply situation, or why they are here. We do not know if this is an advance force or a complete force. We do not know if more vessels are coming through whatever dimensional anomaly deposited them on our homeworld." Worf clasped his hands behind his back. "I propose that before we commit another ground force to the Kor'vakh basin, we conduct a full intelligence assessment. Sensor saturation of their perimeter. Passive monitoring of their communications, if they have any we can intercept. And I propose that someone attempt to make contact." The reaction was what he had expected. Not outrage, exactly, but the Klingon equivalent of it, which was a kind of loud, performative incredulity that served as a substitute for actually engaging with an idea that made people uncomfortable. "Contact," Drath said, as though the word itself was an insult. "They have not attempted to expand their perimeter," Worf said over the noise. "In 22 hours since landing, they have not moved beyond the defensive position they established in the first 4 hours. They defeated Torath's force and then they stopped. That is not the behavior of an army that came here to conquer. That is the behavior of an army that came here by accident and is trying to understand where it is." He let that settle. "Which means there may be a window. A brief one, closing as their commander assesses the strategic situation more fully, but a window nonetheless, in which contact is possible before this becomes a war of extermination." Gowron leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the chamber with the expression he wore when he was calculating something he did not want anyone to see him calculating. The chamber waited. "You will make contact," he said finally, looking back at Worf. "You personally. With a small team. You will go to the Kor'vakh basin and you will find out what these things want and where they came from and whether they can be reasoned with." His eyes narrowed. "And if they cannot be reasoned with, you will find out how they can be killed. That information, I will find equally useful." Worf inclined his head. "Understood, Chancellor." "And Worf." Gowron's voice dropped to something that was almost private, almost outside the performance of being Chancellor. "Do not embarrass the Empire." It was, Worf reflected as he left the chamber, both a threat and the closest thing to an expression of faith that Gowron was capable of. In Klingon politics, the two were frequently indistinguishable. He had 48 hours before Gowron's patience ran out and he sent another ground force. Probably less. The Kor'vakh basin at dawn was a landscape that seemed to have been designed by someone with strong opinions about the nature of hostility. The volcanic rock stretched in every direction like the frozen surface of a black sea, cracked and upthrust in jagged formations that caught the pale light of Qo'noS's sun and threw it back in dull, unhelpful angles. Steam vented from fissures in the ground where geothermal activity kept the deep rock warm regardless of surface temperature, and the air carried the permanent mineral bite of sulfur compounds that the Klingon had long since stopped noticing and that made Worf's human-raised sinuses register a protest he ignored. It was, he thought, not an uncomfortable place for soldiers who had trained on a hell world. The Sardaukar had chosen their landing zone with more cultural instinct than they probably knew. He had brought 4 people. Lieutenant Commander Lorik, a Defense Force intelligence officer whose primary qualification was that she spoke 9 languages and had a gift for reading body language across species lines. 2 warriors from the Chancellor's personal guard, selected not for their rank but for their demonstrated ability to stand still and not attack something without orders, which was a rarer quality in the Klingon Defense Force than military doctrine officially acknowledged. And a Federation Universal Translator Specialist, a young human woman named Ensign Dara Vasquez, who had been stationed at the Klingon Diplomatic Liaison Office on Qo'noS and who had the particular expression of someone who had signed up for a diplomatic posting and was still processing how thoroughly her expectations had been revised. They approached the Sardaukar perimeter on foot, weapons holstered, carrying a standard communication beacon broadcasting on every frequency their equipment could generate. The beacon had been transmitting for 6 hours with no response. Worf had come anyway, because the absence of a response was not the same as the absence of listening. They were stopped 400 meters from the perimeter's outer edge by 2 Sardaukar who appeared from behind a rock formation with the kind of absolute silence that suggested they had been there for some time, waiting. The soldiers were tall, armored in the layered ceramic and fabric construction that Klingon sensors had identified, and they held their weapons. A design that Vasquez would later describe as functioning on a principle between a projectile weapon and a directed energy weapon, which was not quite either, with the relaxed, precise grip of people who had been holding weapons since before they could reliably walk. They did not fire. They did not speak. They looked at Worf's group with the flat, assessing regard of sentries who had been given specific instructions about what to do with approaching contacts and were following those instructions with complete fidelity. Worf raised one hand, palm outward. The universal gesture, or as universal as anything got across the genuine distance of species and culture. I am Worf, son of Mok, of the Klingon Defense Force and Starfleet. I am here to speak with your commander. Nothing happened for 12 seconds. Then one of the sentries touched a communications device at his collar and spoke in a language that the universal translator processed for 3 full seconds before producing anything, which was itself informative. The translator had encountered languages it could not immediately parse before, but 3 seconds of processing time suggested a linguistic structure that shared essentially no root commonality with anything in its database. What it finally produced was approximate and flagged with uncertainty markers, but it was something. The sentry was reporting their presence. The response that came back through the communicator was brief. The sentry looked at Worf with an expression that communicated nothing whatsoever, which was its own kind of communication, and then stepped aside. They were walked into the perimeter by an escort of 6 soldiers who materialized from positions that Worf's own trained eye had completely failed to identify, which told him something important about their concealment discipline. The interior of the Sardaukar position was not what he had expected, and he was a man who had learned to be careful about expectations. He had anticipated the functional brutality of a military encampment under field conditions, equipment staged efficiently, soldiers resting in rotations, the organized chaos of a force that had landed in a hurry and was still sorting itself out. What he found was order. Not the order of a force that had had time to establish itself, but the order of a force that imposed structure as a reflex, the way some people breathe. Supply caches were arranged with geometric precision. Soldiers moved between positions on routes that were clearly designated and clearly observed. There was no waste motion. There was no noise beyond what was functionally necessary. And everywhere, the same quality that the sensor data had suggested, but that was far more striking in person, the absolute, unperturbed stillness of people who existed in a permanent state of readiness without it costing them anything. Vasquez leaned close to Worf's ear. "They're not tense," she murmured. "I've been in military installations under threat conditions. People are tense. These people are calibrated," Worf said quietly. Colonel-Bashar Zumkaran received them in the open, standing beside a field table covered in what appeared to be hand-drawn maps, actual physical maps, rendered in ink on material that Vasquez would later identify as a form of treated animal skin. He was taller than Worf had estimated from the sensor data, and he had the particular physical quality of extreme fitness that had nothing to do with size. A density of presence, a sense that every part of him was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing at all times, with nothing left over for display. He looked at Worf's group with eyes that performed a rapid, systematic assessment and then settled into a watchful patience. The universal translator was still working on the language. Worf used it anyway, because the alternative was silence. Colonel-Bashar. I am Worf, son of Mok. I speak for Chancellor Gowron of the Klingon Empire. This world is Qo'noS, the Klingon homeworld. We received no communication of your approach and no declaration of intent. I am here to understand why you are here and what you require. Karen listened to the translation with no visible reaction. Then he spoke, and the translator worked for 4 seconds before rendering it, imperfectly, into something navigable. You are the governing species of this world. We are. Your military engaged us upon our arrival. You appeared without warning in our atmosphere and did not respond to any hail. Our forces acted according to standing defense protocols. Something moved in Karen's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a form of professional acknowledgement. Your forces were brave, he said, through the translator's approximation. They were not well deployed, but they were brave. The commander who led the final charge, he died well. Lorik made a small sound beside Worf that he recognized as the Klingon response to having a complicated feeling about a compliment. It was, he reflected, probably the most diplomatically significant thing that had happened in this conversation so far. General Torath was a warrior of the Empire, Worf said. His death will be remembered. He held Karen's gaze. Can you tell me how you came to be here? The Colonel-Bashar was quiet for a moment. He looked at the hand-drawn maps on his field table, then at the sky above Qo'noS, where the faint orange haze of spice-saturated atmosphere was still visible in the upper reaches if you knew where to look. Our navigator miscalculated, he said. The Fold space transit was catastrophically unstable. The vessel is gone. We are, the translator struggled with the next word, cycling through several approximations before settling on one. Repositioned. Repositioned, Worf repeated. We are soldiers of the Padishah Emperor. We go where we are sent or where circumstance deposits us. We are here. We will not pretend otherwise, and we will not pretend to be less than what we are. Karen looked at Worf with the directness of a man who had decided that clarity was more tactically useful than deception. We have 8,000 soldiers, Colonel. We have supplies for 60 days at combat consumption rates. We have no means of returning to our galaxy. And we have defeated the only ground force your government has committed against us. He paused. I am telling you this because you came here without weapons drawn to ask questions rather than demand answers. That is a quality I respect. I am offering you the same quality in return. Worf absorbed this. Beside him, Vasquez had gone very still in the way that people went still when they were doing rapid calculations they did not want to interrupt with movement. You understand, Worf said carefully, that the Klingon Empire will not accept a foreign military force on its homeworld. Whatever the circumstances of your arrival. I understand that completely, Karen said. I would think less of you if your empire's position were otherwise. He picked up one of the hand-drawn maps from the field table and looked at it with an expression that was, for the first time, something other than purely assessing. Something that might, in a different face, have been called the weight of an impossible situation. Which is why I suggest, son of Mok, that you and I find a solution before my soldiers finish calculating the same thing I have already calculated. And what have you calculated? Worf asked. Karen set the map down. That 8,000 Sardaukar with 60 days of supplies and no way home are either an asset to someone in this galaxy or a catastrophe for everyone in it. And that window, he looked at Worf with absolute clarity, is also approximately 60 days. Worf returned to the first city with 3 things: a recording of the full exchange with Karen, a preliminary linguistic dataset that Vasquez estimated would give the universal translator 80% accuracy within 72 hours, and a problem that he was already certain the High Council was going to respond to incorrectly. He was right. The council chamber received his report with the particular quality of attention that Klingon politicians gave to information they had already decided how to interpret before it finished being delivered. He laid out the exchange methodically, Karen's candor about the navigator's failure, the supply timeline, the implicit offer that 8,000 stranded elite soldiers represented a resource as much as a threat. He presented it the way he had learned to present things to the council over years of fractious engagement with Klingon politics, which was to say without editorial comment, because editorial comment from Worf tended to function as an accelerant rather than a moderating influence. He finished. The chamber was briefly quiet. Then it was not. 60 days, Gowron said, and the way he said it made clear that he was not thinking about diplomacy. He was thinking about arithmetic. In 60 days their supplies are exhausted. A force of 8,000 without resupply becomes a force of 8,000 who will take what they need from wherever they can reach. They are not an asset. They are a countdown. That is one interpretation, Worf said. Give me another one. They are 8,000 of the finest soldiers I have personally encountered evidence of, stranded on our homeworld with no ideological stake in this galaxy's conflicts, commanded by an officer who has already demonstrated more strategic transparency than most enemies offer voluntarily. They are not loyal to any power in this quadrant. That loyalty is available. He looked around the chamber. The question is who offers them a purpose before desperation manufactures one for them. You would have us hire them, Drath said, with the tone of a man identifying an obscenity. I would have us think before we act. Which is not the same thing, but it is a start. What followed was 40 minutes of debate that Worf participated in with decreasing frequency as it became clear that the Council's appetite for strategic nuance was being steadily consumed by something older and more reflexive. He had seen it before, the way a room full of warriors, when presented with a problem that had a violent solution and a non-violent solution, would reliably spend 40 minutes talking about the non-violent solution before arriving, with great energy, at the violent one. It was not stupidity. It was culture. It was the accumulated weight of 6 centuries of a warrior civilization that had survived by ensuring that the cost of challenging it always exceeded the benefit. The problem was that Karen had already run those numbers. Worf was fairly certain that the Colonel-Bashar had run them before his landers had finished cooling. He requested a private audience with Gowron after the session, because some conversations were better conducted outside the theater of the council chamber, and because Gowron, whatever his political liabilities, was not a stupid man. He was a man who had survived Klingon politics for 15 years, which required a particular form of intelligence that did not always manifest as wisdom but was never accurately described as its absence. They met in the Chancellor's private receiving room, a space of severe, undecorated stone that Gowron maintained in deliberate contrast to the ornamented grandeur of the council chamber. A single bat'leth hung on the wall. A table. 2 chairs. Gowron poured 2 cups of warnog without asking and set one in front of Worf with the blunt hospitality of a man who had not forgotten how to perform it even when he had forgotten why. You think we are making a mistake, Gowron said. I think we are about to make one, Worf said. There is still time to not make it. The Council will authorize another ground assault within 24 hours. 3 times the force. Coordinated with orbital bombardment of the perimeter's outer ring to suppress their anti-air capability before troops deploy. Gowron drank. It will work or it will not. Either way, the situation resolves. It will not work, Worf said, and he said it with the flatness of a statement rather than the energy of an argument, because he had learned that Gowron responded better to the former. Chancellor, I have reviewed the Kor'vakh engagement data 4 times. I have reviewed the perimeter sensor scans. These soldiers do not have a threshold at which they break. Not a conventional one. They were trained on a world that kills the ones who break. What survived that world is what is sitting in the basin right now, and what is sitting in that basin right now is not something that triple the force and orbital bombardment will resolve, because the problem is not their numbers or their equipment. The problem is what they are made of. Gowron set down his cup. He looked at Worf with an expression that was complicated in the way that Gowron's expressions were always complicated, layered with political calculation and personal history and the particular defensiveness of a man who had built his authority on never appearing uncertain. "What are they made of?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, which from Gowron was a form of trust. Worf thought about how to answer it. He thought about standing in the Kor'vakh basin with the steam rising from the volcanic fissures and the orange haze drifting in the upper atmosphere and the absolute, settled stillness of 8,000 soldiers who have been made into weapons by a process so thorough that the weapons no longer knew they were anything else. He thought about Karen's eyes when he had said we will not pretend to be less than what we are, and the quality of that statement, which was not arrogance. Arrogance required an audience. That statement had been something else. A fact, offered without expectation of any particular response. "They are made of the same thing we are made of," Worf said. "Except that we chose it, or we believe we chose it, and they were made to have no choice at all. They were forged into warriors the way a weapon is forged, without their consent, without alternatives, without any identity outside of what the process produced." He paused. "They are, in some ways, the most purely Klingon non-Klingon I have ever encountered. And that is precisely what makes them dangerous, because we do not know how to fight ourselves." Gowron was quiet for a long moment. Outside the receiving room, somewhere deep in the first city, a defense alert klaxon cycled briefly and then went silent, a routine sensor check, probably, but in the current atmosphere every sound carried implication. "Karen told you they were either an asset or a catastrophe," Gowron said. "Yes. He told you that because he wanted you to bring it back to me." "Yes. He is maneuvering. He is communicating," Worf said. "The difference matters. A man who is maneuvering hides his intentions. Karen told me exactly what his situation was, exactly what his timeline is, and exactly what the logical outcomes are. That is not maneuvering. That is a soldier who knows he is in an impossible position and is trying to solve it before it solves him." He met Gowron's eyes. "He is more like you than you would be comfortable admitting." Gowron's expression shifted through several phases rapidly enough that Worf could not track all of them. What settled on his face at the end of the process was something that might have been, in another man, reluctant amusement. "You have become more Klingon in your diplomacy," he said. "Direct insults disguised as compliments." "I learned from the best," Worf said, which was either diplomatic or accurate depending on how one interpreted it. Gowron stood and walked to the room's single narrow window, which looked out over the first city at an angle that showed the distant northern horizon, the direction of the Kor'vakh basin, though it was far too distant to see anything. He stood there for a while with his hands clasped behind his back in an unconscious echo of the posture Worf had used in the council chamber, and Worf let the silence run because Gowron doing his thinking in silence was significantly more productive than Gowron doing his thinking out loud. "I will hold the assault authorization for 72 hours, Gowron said finally, still looking at the horizon. "You will use that time to continue contact with their commander. You will find out if there is a framework, any framework, in which 8,000 soldiers without a home become something other than a war we fight on our own ground." He turned from the window. "And Worf. If you find that framework, it must be one that does not require me to explain to the High Council why the Klingon Empire is negotiating with invaders. Because that conversation ends my chancellorship and begins a civil conflict we do not have time for." "Understood," Worf said. "Find me something I can call a victory," Gowron said. "I do not care what it actually is. I need it to look like a victory." Worf picked up his warnog and drank it in one motion. "In my experience," he said, setting the cup down, "the best victories are the ones that are also actually victories. I will attempt to find you one of those." He left the Chancellor's receiving room with 72 hours and no clear idea of how to use them, which was, he reflected, a more familiar position than he would have preferred. The first city moved around him as he walked. Warriors and bureaucrats and the endless machinery of an empire that had survived 6 centuries by being harder to kill than everything that had tried to kill it. Somewhere to the north, Zoomkaren was looking at his maps and doing his own calculations. The 72 hours had already started. The second meeting in the Kor'vakh basin was different from the first in ways that were immediately apparent and some that took longer to surface. The most immediately apparent difference was that Zoomkaren had set up a formal meeting space, a cleared area of volcanic rock with a field table and seating on both sides, the kind of arrangement that communicated an intention to talk for an extended period, which was itself a form of information. The less immediately apparent difference was the quality of attention the Sardaukar soldiers directed at Worf's team as they approached. Not the flat assessment of the first visit. Something more calibrated. They had spent 48 hours watching, listening, and processing, and what looked out from behind their eyes now was not the blank readiness of soldiers encountering an unknown but the focused readiness of soldiers who had formed preliminary conclusions and were testing them. Vasquez had the translator running at 73% accuracy, which she described as functional and Worf described as sufficient. Zoomkaren had apparently reached a similar assessment, because he opened the meeting without preamble and without the measured diplomatic delay that most commanders use to establish conversational dominance. He simply sat down and began. "Your government is considering a second assault," he said. It was not a question. "My government is considering its options," Worf said. "Which include a second assault." "Which include a range of responses," Worf said, which was accurate without being informative, and Zoomkaren acknowledged it with a slight inclination of his head that the translator flagged as a culturally ambiguous gesture carrying possible meanings including respect, dismissal, or the Sardaukar equivalent of a shrug. "I will tell you what a second assault will cost," Zoomkaren said. "Not to threaten. To inform. My Burseg has modeled the engagement parameters based on your defense force's tactical doctrine as observed in the first engagement and as supplemented by what our sensor equipment has been able to gather regarding troop movements in the past 48 hours. He paused. "A force 3 times the size of the first, supported by orbital bombardment of the outer perimeter, will break our anti-air capability in the first 20 minutes. We will lose between 300 and 400 soldiers in that phase. The subsequent ground assault will reach our inner perimeter in approximately 40 minutes, at which point the engagement becomes close quarters. We will lose another 200 to 300 soldiers." He looked at Worf steadily. "Your forces will lose between 2,000 and 3,000. The number sat on the table between them like something with mass. "My Burseg believes those figures are conservative," Zoomkaren added. Worf did not respond immediately, because the immediate response that came to him was not the one that would serve the next 72 hours. He let the number settle and looked at it from the angle of a military officer rather than a Klingon, which required a small but deliberate act of perspective. 2,000 to 3,000 Klingon warriors. Against what? 300 to 400 more Sardaukar dead and a perimeter that would still be standing. "You are not telling me this to negotiate from strength," Worf said. "No," Zoomkaren agreed. "I am telling you this because I have 8,000 soldiers, and in 58 days their supplies are exhausted, and I have no capacity to resupply them from this galaxy's resources without taking those resources by force. 2,000 to 3,000 of your warriors dying in an assault that does not resolve the situation does not improve my timeline. It degrades it. Dead Klingon do not feed my soldiers." He folded his hands on the table. "I am trying to solve a problem. I would prefer to solve it with you present at the table rather than with your government reduced to sending larger forces until one of them succeeds. Both paths end with Sardaukar dead. Only one of them ends with a solution." Burseg Shira had taken a position to Zoomkaren's left, and she was watching this exchange with the quality of attention of someone who had opinions about it but had been specifically instructed to keep them internal. Worf filed that away. The relationship between commander and deputy would matter eventually. "Tell me about your emperor," Worf said. Karen's response to this was a stillness that the translator could not help with, because it was not linguistic. It was the stillness of a man encountering a question that reached past the professional layer directly into something more fundamental, and choosing, in real time, how much of what was underneath to allow to the surface. The God Emperor is the axis around which the Imperium turns, he said, finally. His vision encompasses millennia. His rule is absolute. We are, the translator cycled. His instrument. His edge. We exist to enforce his will across the universe. And here, Worf said, there is no emperor. The stillness again. Longer this time. No, Karen said. There is not. Which means there is no will to enforce. Which means, Karen said carefully, that we are soldiers without a mission. And soldiers without a mission, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Worf understood. It was not a supply problem, ultimately. It was an identity problem. The Sardaukar were not merely an army. They were a theological expression, the Emperor's wrath made flesh, the living proof of his dominion over human capability. Remove the Emperor from that equation and you did not have 8,000 highly trained soldiers looking for work. You had 8,000 people whose entire self-conception had been built around a purpose that no longer existed in any physically accessible form. The supply timeline was real. The identity crisis was more dangerous. What do your soldiers believe? Worf asked. About where they are. About what happened. Karen was quiet for a moment that felt considered. They believe what I have told them, he said. That we are displaced. That we will find a way to serve the Emperor's purpose even in circumstances he could not have anticipated. That a Sardaukar does not stop being a Sardaukar because the ground beneath his feet has changed. He looked at Worf. Whether they believe it fully is a question I ask myself every morning. The answer is different depending on which of them I am thinking about. Lorik leaned slightly toward Worf. He is telling us there are fracture lines, she murmured, in Klingon, below the translator's pickup range. Worf gave the smallest possible indication that he had heard. Colonel-Bashar, he said. You said at our last meeting that your soldiers are either an asset to someone in this galaxy or a catastrophe for everyone in it. I have spent 48 hours trying to construct a framework that satisfies both my Chancellor's political requirements and your operational reality. I have not succeeded yet. But I want to ask you directly, because I believe you prefer directness, what would serving the Emperor's purpose look like, in a galaxy where the Emperor does not exist? Karen looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something that Worf had not seen him do in either meeting. He leaned back slightly, releasing some fraction of the absolute postural control he maintained, and for just a moment he looked not like a weapon that had been given a voice, but like a man who was carrying something very heavy and had been carrying it since the moment the Heighliner began to come apart around him. The God Emperor's purpose, he said slowly, was order. Not the order of tyranny, though it expressed itself that way. Order in the sense of coherence. A galaxy that functions. That does not consume itself. We were the enforcement of that coherence, the correction of those things that threatened it. He paused. If I were to construct an answer to your question, it would look like this: a galaxy is the same as an imperium in its essential problem. It contains forces that seek to destabilize it, to profit from chaos, to tear down what holds civilization together. A soldier trained to identify and eliminate those forces does not need an emperor to make that work meaningful. He met Worf's eyes. He needs a galaxy worth protecting. The translator rendered this with 90% confidence, which meant the words were approximately right. The weight behind them needed no translation at all. Worf thought about Gowron's instruction. Find me something I can call a victory. He thought about the High Council's appetite for a resolution that looked like Klingon strength rather than Klingon pragmatism. He thought about the Dominion War, which the Empire had survived partly because it had been willing, at critical moments, to fight alongside people it had spent decades treating as enemies. He thought about the 58-day countdown running in the back of every Sardaukar officer's mind. "I need to present something to my Chancellor," Worf said. "Something concrete. Not a philosophy, a structure. A defined engagement, with defined terms, that gives your soldiers a purpose and gives my government something to point at." He looked at Karen. "Are you willing to work toward that?" "I am willing to work toward whatever keeps my soldiers from becoming what they will become if that supply line reaches zero and nothing has changed," Karen said. "Yes." Outside the perimeter, at the edge of sensor range, a Defense Force reconnaissance drone was making its slow, patient circuit. Worf was aware of it. He was also aware that the Sardaukar sensor operators were aware of it, and had been aware of it since it arrived, and had chosen not to destroy it. That choice was, in its way, the most significant diplomatic communication either side had yet produced. They were both still trying to find the window. It was narrowing. But it had not closed. The Terahong colony sat on the edge of the Klingon Empire's spinward frontier, 3 days from Qo'noS at standard warp, on a world that had been settled 2 generations ago by a house whose name nobody in the High Council remembered without consulting records. It was not a prestigious posting. It was not a strategically critical system. It had a garrison of 400 warriors, a population of 11,000 civilians, a dilithium processing facility that contributed modestly to the Empire's energy infrastructure, and a defense grid that had been installed during the Dominion War and not meaningfully upgraded since. It was, in the vocabulary of military logistics, a soft target. The kind of position that exists in every empire's frontier, necessary enough to maintain, not valuable enough to prioritize, defended by soldiers who had been told their posting was honorable and who had, over time, come to suspect it was not. None of this was relevant to how Terahong entered the story, because the force that arrived in its system on the 43rd hour of the Kor'vakh negotiations had not come from Qo'noS. Burseg Shira had taken 1,200 soldiers. The precise moment at which she had decided to do this was something Worf would spend considerable time afterward trying to establish, because it mattered, tactically, diplomatically, and in the more personal sense that understanding when a situation changed was the only way to understand whether anything could have been done to prevent the change. The best reconstruction he could assemble suggested that she had made the decision somewhere in the first 24 hours after landing, when the supply calculations became clear and the contact with the Klingon government produced talking rather than resolution. She had waited. She had watched Karen conduct his meetings with the patience and strategic transparency that she apparently respected and apparently also assessed as insufficient to the timeline. And then she had acted with the quiet, total efficiency of a Sardaukar officer who had identified an objective and seen no reason to delay its execution. 1,200 soldiers. For landers that had been held in reserve, their operational status concealed from Klingon sensor sweeps by a combination of terrain masking and electronic countermeasures that the Defense Force's reconnaissance drones had not been sophisticated enough to penetrate. A transit time of 3 days, during which she had maintained complete communications silence. A planetary approach conducted in the sensor shadow of Terahong's larger moon. The garrison fought. The record was unambiguous on that point, and Worf made sure it remained unambiguous in every report he filed afterward, because it mattered that they fought, that they did not hesitate or flee, that 400 Klingon warriors facing 1,200 Sardaukar chose the path that Klingon warriors always chose when the arithmetic was impossible. They died in 5 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than anyone who reviewed the engagement data afterward expected, and shorter than it needed to be to matter. The civilian population was not harmed. This was the detail that arrived in the High Council chamber alongside the casualty figures and the loss of the dilithium facility and the confirmation that a Sardaukar force was now in fortified control of a Klingon colony world, and it was a detail that the Council did not know how to process. Klingon strategic doctrine had no meaningful framework for an enemy that destroyed your garrison with surgical precision and then declined to harm your civilians. It suggested a level of operational control that was itself alarming. An army capable of that degree of discrimination was an army that was making choices, and an army making choices was more dangerous than an army simply destroying everything in its path, because you could not predict the choices. Worf received the news in the Kor'vakh basin, in the middle of what had been, up to that moment, the most productive conversation of the negotiations. He received it via communicator from Lorik, who delivered it in the flat, careful tone of someone transmitting information they know will change the room. He absorbed it. He set the communicator down. He looked at Karen across the field table. Karen's expression told him, with complete certainty, that the Colonel-Bashar had not known. It was a small mercy and a large complication, and Worf sat with both of them for 3 seconds before he spoke. "Your Burseg has taken a colony world," he said. "Terahong. Frontier system, Spin Ward. Garrison of 400. She arrived with 1,200 soldiers. The garrison is gone." The stillness that fell over Karen was different from all the previous stillnesses. Those had been the stillnesses of control, a man choosing, moment by moment, what to allow to the surface. This stillness was the stillness of a man absorbing something that had reached past his control before he could apply it. It lasted 4 seconds. Then his expression closed into something that had no temperature at all, and he turned to a soldier behind him and spoke in a rapid, clipped sequence that the translator rendered only partially, catching the words Burseg, unauthorized, and a term that the translator flagged as carrying connotations of both discipline and consequences before losing the thread of the sentence entirely. "The civilians," he said to Worf. "Unharmed," Worf said. "The facility is under your force's control. The population has been confined but not harmed." Something moved through Karen's face that was not relief, exactly, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man discovering that a disaster has one fewer dimension than he feared. "She acted outside my orders," he said. "I believe you," Worf said, which was true. "My Chancellor will not." The communicator activated again. It was not Lorik this time. It was a Defense Force signals officer relaying a direct transmission from the first city, which meant Gowron, which meant that the 72-hour window had just collapsed to 0. Worf listened to the transmission with the communicator held away from the table so that Karen could hear it clearly, because there was no longer any utility in managing information between them. The transmission was brief. The assault authorization had been reinstated. 3 times the original force, orbital bombardment component included. Deployment in 18 hours. When the transmission ended, the basin was very quiet. Steam rose from the volcanic fissures. The orange haze drifted in the upper atmosphere. Somewhere in the Sardaukar perimeter, a relief rotation was changing positions with the same geometric precision as every other rotation Worf had observed, the soldiers moving with the calm of people who did not yet know that their Burseg had just detonated the most promising negotiation their Colonel-Bashar had managed to construct. 18 hours, Karen said. "Yes. And the assault on my position here coincides with whatever your government's response to Terahong produces," Worf said. "Yes. You are now looking at a two-front problem." Karen stood. He moved away from the table to the edge of the cleared area and stood looking north, toward nothing in particular, with his hands at his sides and his posture carrying, for the first time, something that was not the absolute control of a man who had processed every variable. He was thinking through something in real time, and Worf watched him do it, because the thinking that Karen did in the next few minutes would determine more outcomes than anything Worf could contribute to the conversation. "She is not wrong," Karen said, without turning. "Strategically. A frontier colony, modest garrison, useful resource facility. It is exactly what I would have recommended if my assessment of the negotiation timeline had led me to the same conclusion she reached." He turned. "She is wrong about the negotiation timeline, but she made that assessment without access to what has happened at this table. I did not share it fully enough." "Why not?" Worf asked. Karen looked at him with an expression that contained, in its layers, something very close to the answer before he spoke it. "Because Sardaukar officers are trained to operate independently when communication is compromised. Because I was trained alongside Shira for 20 years and I know how she thinks, and I believed I had more time before her assessment and mine diverged. He paused. And because I did not want to tell my Burseg that I was placing significant weight on the word of a Klingon diplomat, because the word Sardaukar culture uses for that kind of trust is one that cannot be easily translated but carries meanings adjacent to both hope and vulnerability, and those are not words that Sardaukar officers use in operational contexts. Worf stood. Colonel-Bashar, I need to ask you something directly and I need a direct answer. Ask. Can you bring her back? Can you order Shira to withdraw from Terahong before the Empire's response force arrives, return the colony to Klingon control, and return herself to this position before the 18-hour assault window closes? Zoom Karen looked at him steadily. I can issue the order. Will she follow it? The pause before the answer was the most honest thing Zoom Karen had offered across all their conversations, because it was a pause that contained genuine uncertainty, and genuine uncertainty from this man was rarer and more significant than certainty from almost anyone else Worf had encountered. I do not know, he said. She believes she is serving the Emperor's purpose. She believes the negotiation is failing. She believes that resource acquisition is the only viable survival path. He met Worf's eyes. She is not wrong about the math. She is wrong about what else is possible. And I do not know if I can convince her of that in the time we have. Try, Worf said. Because if she withdraws, I have something to bring to Gowron that he can call a victory. If she does not, he stopped. If she does not, there is no table left to sit at. Zoom Karen held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned to his communications officer and began issuing orders, and Worf stepped away from the table and opened his own communicator and began the considerably more difficult task of calling Gowron and explaining why the 18-hour window needed to become 24, and why the Chancellor should believe that the distinction mattered, and why trusting a stranded enemy commander to rein in his own subordinate was not, in fact, the worst strategic option currently available to the Klingon Empire. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of conversation that made him understand why some people chose simpler careers. Gowron's response to Worf's request for a 24-hour extension was not a yes and was not a no. It was something more characteristic of the Chancellor at his most politically acute, which was a conditional. A yes wrapped in requirements designed to ensure that if the yes produced a bad outcome, the bad outcome could be attributed to the conditions rather than the decision. Worf had navigated enough Klingon political architecture to recognize the structure immediately and to accept it, because a conditional yes from Gowron was functionally superior to a clean no, and the requirements attached were ones he could work with. The requirements were three. First, Worf would remain in the Kor'vakh basin for the duration of the extension as a personal guarantee of continued negotiation, meaning that if the Sardaukar used the additional time to reinforce or expand, Worf's presence there transformed from diplomatic asset to political liability in a way that would end his standing with the Council permanently. Second, a Klingon response force would deploy to Terahong immediately, not to engage but to establish a perimeter and prevent any further Sardaukar expansion from that position, a holding action that would last exactly 24 hours before it became an assault with or without negotiation progress. Third, if Shira's forces had not begun withdrawal from Terahong within 12 hours, the extension collapsed and the assault on the Kor'vakh basin proceeded on the original timeline regardless of whatever was happening at the table. 12 hours for Zoom Karen to reach Shira. 12 hours for Shira to decide. Worf relayed the terms to the Colonel-Bashar with the precise language Gowron had used, because imprecision in terms was where negotiations went to die, and Zoom Karen listened with the focused attention of a man converting words into operational requirements in real time. 12 hours, Zoom Karen said. 12 hours. She is 3 days away at the speed of our landers. I know, Worf said. Which means the conversation happens over communications, not in person. Which means you cannot use everything available to you when speaking with her face to face. Yes. Zoom Karen was quiet for a moment. You understand that this is the most difficult kind of order to give. Not because she will refuse, she may not refuse. But because the order requires me to tell her that the path she chose, which is the path our training and our doctrine and 50 years of Sardaukar operational history would endorse, is the wrong path. Not tactically wrong. Philosophically wrong. I am asking her to unmake a decision that every instinct she has tells her was correct. He looked at Worf. Have you ever given that order to someone you trained with for 20 years? Worf thought about Jadzia. He thought about Martok. He thought about specific moments in the Dominion War when the order that needed to be given was the order that cost something personal and irreplaceable to deliver. Yes, he said. It is the hardest order there is. It is also sometimes the only one that matters. Zoom Karen held his gaze for a moment, then turned to his communications station. What followed was 40 minutes during which Worf deliberately moved to the far edge of the cleared meeting area and did not attempt to observe or intercept the transmission, because there were limits to what surveillance served, and this was one of them. He sat on a section of volcanic rock and watched the orange haze in the upper atmosphere and thought about the structure of the problem with the particular quality of attention he applied to things that had too many variables to solve directly and had to be approached from the sides. The structure was this. Zoom Karen was trying to hold 8,000 soldiers together under conditions that made every instinct those soldiers had been given point toward action rather than negotiation. Shira had followed her instincts, and her instincts were not wrong by the standards of everything she had ever been taught. The only framework in which her action was wrong was a framework she had not been given access to, the specific texture of what had happened at the table, the quality of Zoom Karen's read on Worf, the possibility that this galaxy contained something other than a resource problem and a tactical challenge. She had made a rational decision from incomplete information, and the request being transmitted to her now was asking her to trust that the information she lacked was more important than the information she had. That was not a military problem. That was a faith problem. And Sardaukar faith, Worf was beginning to understand, was not a flexible instrument. Lorik appeared at his shoulder. She had been running her own quiet analysis in the background of every meeting, maintaining the translator systems and watching the Sardaukar soldiers with the professional attention of an intelligence officer who had learned that armies communicated more in their behavior than in anything they said. The soldiers know something is happening, she said quietly. The communications activity is higher than it's been since we arrived. They're watching their officers. What are they reading from them? Uncertainty, Lorik said. Which for these soldiers is apparently a sufficiently unusual experience that it registers visibly. She paused. There is also something else. A subset of soldiers, I have counted approximately 80, positioned in a cluster near the eastern edge of the perimeter, who are behaving differently from the others. More self-contained. Less responsive to the standard rotation patterns. Worf looked at her. Differently how? They are waiting, Lorik said, but they are not waiting for the same thing the others are waiting for. The others are waiting for orders. These ones, she chose her words carefully. These ones look like they have already received orders. Or have decided they do not need them. Worf stood. He filed this information in the part of his mind reserved for things that had not yet become problems but were moving in that direction with purposeful speed. Keep watching them, he said. Tell me immediately if any of them move toward the command position. He walked back to the meeting area as Zoom Karen concluded his transmission and turned from the communication station. The Colonel-Bashar's face carried the expression of a man who had said everything he had to say and was now waiting to find out if it had been enough. It was the first time Worf had seen him look like someone who was waiting for something outside his control. She received it, Zoom Karen said. She will consider and respond. How long? She will not make me wait longer than she has to. Whatever she decides, she will tell me quickly. He moved back to the field table and sat, and the movement had a deliberateness to it that suggested he was using the physical act of sitting to manage something internal. While we wait, I want to ask you something. Ask, Worf said. The Dominion War, Zoom Karen said. The translator rendered it with confidence, which meant the term had entered his vocabulary from the monitoring his forces had been conducting. Your forces fought alongside the Federation. An alliance between two civilizations with centuries of conflict and mutual suspicion. How did it hold together? Worf considered the question from several angles before choosing one. It held together because the alternative was extinction, he said. Which is a powerful motivator but not a sufficient one by itself. Alliances built only on shared threat tend to fracture the moment the threat is perceived differently by each party. What held the Khitomer Accords alliance together through the Dominion War was not the Dominion. It was the relationships built across the table by people who were willing to be changed by the encounter. He looked at Zoom Karen. Martok and Sisko. Worf and Dax. People who met as representatives of opposed civilizations and became, he searched for the word. Invested. In each other's survival, beyond the strategic calculus. Personal investment as strategic infrastructure, Zoom Karen said slowly. Yes. My training identified that as a vulnerability. Your training, Worf said carefully, was designed for a universe where the Emperor's will was the only organizing principle that mattered. In that universe, personal investment is a vulnerability because it creates loyalties that compete with absolute obedience. He met the Colonel-Bashar's eyes. You are not in that universe anymore. The communication station activated. Zoom Karen was on his feet before the signal had fully resolved, crossing to the station with a speed that was the first purely reactive movement Worf had seen from him. He listened. His back was to Worf, and Worf watched the set of his shoulders as the message came through and made no attempt to read the translation before Zoom Karen chose to share it, because some information needed to arrive through the right channel to mean the right thing. Zoom Karen turned. His expression was the expression of a man who had received an answer that was not the answer he had hoped for and was processing the distance between what he had hoped and what was real with the same discipline he applied to everything else, which meant the processing was invisible except to someone who had been watching him long enough to know what invisible looked like on his face. She will not withdraw, he said. The 12-hour window had 6 hours remaining. In Terahong, 1,200 Sardaukar soldiers were fortifying a colony world they had taken from the Klingon Empire. In the Kor'vakh basin, 80 soldiers near the eastern perimeter were waiting for something that was not orders. And in the first city, Gowron was looking at a chronometer with the patience of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the clock to confirm it. Worf looked at Zoom Karen. Then we have 6 hours to find a solution that does not require her cooperation, he said. And I need you to tell me about those 80 soldiers near your eastern perimeter, because my intelligence officer has been watching them for 3 hours and I think you know exactly what they are waiting for. The Colonel-Bashar went very still. It was a different stillness from all the previous ones. This one had the quality of a man arriving at the moment he had been hoping would not come, finding it had come anyway, and choosing how to meet it. Yes, he said quietly. I know what they are waiting for. His back was to Worf, and Worf watched the set of his shoulders as the message came through and made no attempt to read the translation before Zoom Karen chose to share it, because some information needed to arrive through the right channel to mean the right thing. Zoom Karen turned. His expression was the expression of a man who had received an answer that was not the answer he had hoped for and was processing the distance between what he had hoped and what was real with the same discipline he applied to everything else, which meant the processing was invisible except to someone who had been watching him long enough to know what invisible looked like on his face. She will not withdraw, he said. The 12-hour window had 6 hours remaining. In Terahong, 1,200 Sardaukar soldiers were fortifying a colony world they had taken from the Klingon Empire. In the Kor'vakh basin, 80 soldiers near the eastern perimeter were waiting for something that was not orders. And in the first city, Gowron was looking at a chronometer with the patience of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the clock to confirm it. Worf looked at Zoom Karen. Then we have 6 hours to find a solution that does not require her cooperation, he said. And I need you to tell me about those 80 soldiers near your eastern perimeter, because my intelligence officer has been watching them for 3 hours and I think you know exactly what they are waiting for. The Colonel-Bashar went very still. It was a different stillness from all the previous ones. This one had the quality of a man arriving at the moment he had been hoping would not come, finding it had come anyway, and choosing how to meet it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know what they are waiting for." The 80 soldiers near the eastern perimeter had a name. In Sardaukar organizational structure, Karen explained, they were designated a punishment detail, which the translator rendered with the uncertainty flag that indicated the literal translation was accurate but the cultural weight was not fully captured. In the Imperium, punishment details were not disciplinary assignments. They were the opposite. They were soldiers selected for the most extreme operations precisely because their psychological profile indicated a capacity for sustained violence that exceeded even Sardaukar norms, soldiers who had come through Salusa Secundus changed in ways that made them assets in specific contexts and liabilities in most others. They were not rogue. They were not undisciplined. They were, in the precise technical sense of Sardaukar doctrine, a weapon with a very specific use case, and they had been waiting, since the moment the Heighliner came apart above Qo'noS, for someone to point them at something. Shira had pointed them at something before she left. Karen had discovered the standing order she had left with their designated handler. A sub-commander named Praxt, whose file, when Karen walked Worf through it with the flat precision of a man dismantling a structure he had built and was now required to tear down, contained an operational history that read like a catalogue of extreme solutions to extreme problems. The order was conditional. If Shira did not receive a withdrawal command within 12 hours of her transmission, Praxt was authorized to execute an operation she had designated as contingency leverage. A strike on the first city's primary defense grid relay station, located 11 kilometers from the Kor'vakh perimeter's eastern edge, accessible through a series of geothermal tunnels that Sardaukar sensor sweeps had mapped in the first 48 hours after landing. The logic was Shira's and it was not irrational. A crippled defense grid relay gave the Sardaukar in Terahong a window to consolidate their position before Klingon orbital assets could coordinate a response. It gave the Kor'vakh contingent leverage in any resumed negotiation. And it demonstrated, in terms that Klingon military doctrine could not ignore, that the Sardaukar operating position extended further than the perimeter they had declared. It was a move designed to reshape the board rather than win a single engagement, which meant it came from a strategic mind that was thinking past the immediate crisis to something that looked, from a certain angle, almost like a long-term plan. The problem was that a strike on the first city's defense grid relay station, executed by 80 Sardaukar punishment detail soldiers moving through geothermal tunnels beneath the Klingon capital, was not a move that produced more negotiation. It was a move that produced Gowron standing in front of the High Council with exactly the justification he needed to commit the Empire to a war of extermination that would not end until either the Klingon or the Sardaukar ceased to exist as a functional military force. And in a war of extermination, even 8,000 Sardaukar, however extraordinary, would eventually exhaust themselves against an opponent with the population base, the industrial capacity, and the theological commitment to vengeance that the Klingon Empire could bring to bear. Shira was brilliant and she was wrong, and she was 3 days away, and she had set a clock running that had 5 hours and 40 minutes remaining. "Can Praxt be stopped by your order?" Worf asked. "Praxt follows Shira's authority in Shira's absence," Karen said. "That is the structure she established when she left. She anticipated that I might attempt to countermand her contingency." He paused. "She is thorough. Then we cannot stop this through your command structure." "No." Worf stood very still for a moment, which was his own version of the processing stillness he had observed in Karen, and which served the same function, buying the space between receiving information and responding to it for something other than reaction to occupy. He thought about the tunnel system. 11 kilometers. 80 soldiers. 5 hours and 40 minutes. He thought about what options existed in that geometry. "I need your full sensor mapping of the tunnel network," he said. "Everything your teams gathered in the first 48 hours. And I need it in the next 10 minutes. Karen looked at him with an expression that contained, in its layers, several simultaneous assessments running in parallel. What he was sharing would be, by any reasonable definition of the term, classified military intelligence. It would give the Klingon Defense Force detailed knowledge of a reconnaissance operation that the Sardaukar had conducted covertly. It would expose the extent of their information gathering in the first days after landing. It would, in short, hand Worf a document that a Klingon military intelligence officer would describe as extraordinarily valuable and that a Sardaukar officer would describe as a profound security compromise. "You understand what you are asking me to give you," Zoomkaren said. "Yes," Worf said. "And you understand what happens if Praxt reaches that relay station." The Colonel-Bashar held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned to his intelligence officer and gave the order, and 7 minutes later Worf had a data chip in his hand containing the most detailed subsurface mapping of the first city's geothermal tunnel network that the Klingon Defense Force had ever possessed, produced by an enemy force in 48 hours of covert reconnaissance, handed over by that force's commander in an act that had no precise name in Sardaukar doctrine because it had never been necessary to name it before. Worf opened his communicator. He did not call Gowron. He called Martok, because Martok was a general before he was a politician and would understand operational requirements faster than political ones, and because what Worf was about to propose required someone who could authorize military action without needing to present it to the Council first. He laid it out in 90 seconds. The tunnel network. The punishment detail. The timeline. What needed to happen and how quickly. Martok listened without interrupting, which was one of the qualities that had made him a general worth following into impossible situations. "You want a defense force team in those tunnels before Praxt moves," Martok said. "I want a defense force team and I want to lead it," Worf said. A pause. "You are currently our only functioning diplomatic channel to 8,000 stranded elite soldiers." "I am aware," Worf said. "Which is why I am not proposing to destroy Praxt's unit. I am proposing to intercept it. To reach Praxt before he reaches the relay station and present him with information that Shira's order did not account for." "What information?" "That his Colonel-Bashar is willing to give Klingon military intelligence classified Sardaukar reconnaissance data to prevent this operation," Worf said. "Because a soldier trained to enforce orders should be able to recognize, if the argument is made correctly, that what Shira ordered and what order actually requires in this situation are not the same thing." Another pause, longer. "You are going into a geothermal tunnel system to have a philosophical argument with 80 of the most dangerous soldiers in another universe," Martok said. "Yes," Worf said. "With what force?" Worf looked at Zoomkaren. "I would like to take the Colonel-Bashar with me," he said. "With your authorization." Zoomkaren, who had heard every word of the transmission, met his eyes and did not hesitate. "Yes," he said simply. Martok was quiet for 4 seconds. "I will have a Defense Force insertion team at your position in 40 minutes. 6 warriors. The best I can pull without triggering Council notification." His voice carried the particular tone he used when he had assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion he respected even when he found it uncomfortable. "Worf. If this goes wrong." "It will not go wrong," Worf said, which was not a statement of certainty but a statement of intention, which in Klingon culture carried its own weight. "May you die well if it does," Martok said, which was the highest comfort he knew how to offer. The 40 minutes while they waited for the insertion team were the most operationally dense 40 minutes of the negotiation. Worf and Zoomkaren worked through the tunnel map together at the field table, identifying Praxt's most likely route, his probable timing, the choke points where an intercept was viable versus the sections where the tunnel dimensions would turn a confrontation into a bloodbath with no room for anything other than violence. The Colonel-Bashar worked the map with the focused speed of a man who had memorized it on the first pass and was now running tactical overlays in his head, and Worf matched him with the spatial reasoning he had developed across 20 years of unconventional operations. They identified 3 viable intercept points. The first was too close to the Sardaukar perimeter, Praxt would have backup within range. The third was too close to the relay station. Not enough margin if Praxt refused the argument and pushed through. The second was a natural chamber in the geothermal system, 12 meters across, with 3 tunnel entrances and a ceiling high enough that the space would not psychologically compress the confrontation into something that could only resolve one way. "He will not stop for me," Zoomkaren said, looking at the second intercept point. "Not if Shira's order is still active in his mind as the governing authority. I need to make him stop for himself." "How?" Worf asked. "By giving him something that supersedes the order without countermanding it," Zoomkaren said. "Shira's contingency was designed for a situation in which negotiation had failed. If I can demonstrate to Prax that negotiation has not failed, that it has produced something real, something that a Sardaukar can point to as a concrete outcome, he has grounds to suspend the operation on his own authority. Punishment detail subcommanders have that discretion when circumstances materially change. What counts as something real?" Zoomkaren looked at him. "You," he said. "You coming into those tunnels. A Klingon officer, entering Sardaukar mapped territory, in the company of his enemy's commander, to stop an operation that would give the Klingon Empire justification for war." He held Worf's gaze. "That is not a negotiating position. That is a demonstration. And Sardaukar are trained to recognize demonstrations of genuine commitment, because the God Emperor's court was full of people who said things and the Sardaukar existed to identify the ones who meant them." The Defense Force insertion team arrived at 38 minutes. 6 warriors, as promised, in civilian gear with weapons configured for stun rather than kill, which had been Worf's specific request and which the team leader, a veteran sergeant named Koth, had accepted with the professional neutrality of a soldier who had stopped asking why a long time ago. Worf looked at the team. He looked at Zoomkaren. He looked at the tunnel entrance that the map indicated was 40 meters inside the Sardaukar perimeter's eastern edge, which Zoomkaren had already arranged access through with 2 words to his perimeter commander. 4 hours and 50 minutes. "Colonel-Bashar," Worf said. "After you." The geothermal tunnels beneath Qo'noS were not designed for human passage. They were not designed for anything. They were the organic consequence of 600 million years of volcanic activity beneath a world that had been geologically violent since before anything lived on its surface, and they expressed this history in their architecture, which was to say they had no architecture. The walls were raw basalt, fractured and refused in layers that recorded eruptions the way tree rings recorded seasons, and the floor was alternately smooth where ancient lava flows had cooled into glass and brutally uneven where subsequent activity had shattered those flows and left the fragments where they fell. The air was hot and wet and carried the sulfur compound smell of the surface amplified by confinement, and every 30 seconds or so a deep vibration moved through the rock from some process far below that the human nervous system registered as the planet reminding you of its indifference to your presence. Worf moved through it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had trained in worse environments and kept his attention on 2 things simultaneously. The map in his left hand and Zoomkaren moving ahead of him with a quality of tunnel navigation that confirmed what Worf had suspected, which was that the Colonel-Bashar had conducted at least some of this reconnaissance personally rather than delegating it entirely. He moved through the irregular passages with the specific confidence of familiarity, not the general confidence of a skilled soldier in unknown terrain. He had been here before. Behind them, the 6 Defense Force warriors maintained the interval discipline that Koth had established in the first 30 seconds of entry, 5 meters between each soldier, weapons ready but angled down, movement as quiet as the terrain allowed. They were good. Worf had worked with worse in operations that had higher preparation time and clearer parameters, and he noted their quality with the background appreciation of a commander who filed that kind of information automatically. They reached the first intercept point at 40 minutes in. Zoomkaren paused, examined the tunnel junction, checked the map against his memory, and shook his head. "They passed through here," he said quietly. The translator rendered it at 88% confidence, which was sufficient. He indicated marks on the tunnel floor, a pattern that Worf's eye parsed as footprints only after Zoomkaren pointed at them, which said something about the difference between Sardaukar field craft and Klingon tracking doctrine. "How far ahead?" Worf asked. 40 minutes, perhaps less. They would have moved faster than us through this section, they have the map memorized. Karen looked at the tunnel leading toward the second intercept point. Praxt will have set a pace. He is methodical. He will arrive at the relay station at the moment Shira's deadline expires, not before and not after. How long until that deadline? Karen checked the chronometer at his wrist. A device of Dune Universe manufacture that Worf had noticed was mechanical rather than electronic, which was a choice that spoke volumes about a civilization that had developed technologies in a specific sequence. 3 hours, 14 minutes. Worf ran the geometry. Second intercept point was 40 minutes ahead at their current pace. Praxt's unit was 40 minutes ahead of them. Which meant that if Praxt was moving at the pace Karen estimated, the Sardaukar punishment detail would reach the second intercept chamber approximately 20 minutes before Worf's team. 20 minutes of waiting, in a space that had 3 entrances, for a group of 80 soldiers who had been told they were on an authorized operation and whose first instinct upon encountering unexpected company in a geothermal tunnel would not be to initiate a philosophical discussion. "We need to move faster," Worf said. What followed was 23 minutes of movement through the tunnel system at a pace that the terrain was not designed to accommodate, which meant it was a pace that extracted payment from everyone attempting it. Koth's team absorbed the cost with the controlled grimness of professionals. Karen moved with an adaptability that continued to impress Worf in the specific way that competence always impressed him. Not with surprise but with the clean satisfaction of an expectation confirmed. Worf moved the way he always moved in extreme physical circumstances, which was by reducing everything that was not necessary to the distance between his current position and his objective to a level of processing that required no conscious attention, freeing the conscious part of his mind for what mattered. What mattered was Praxt. What mattered was what he was going to say when they reached him and how he was going to say it in a language the translator could only render at 73% accuracy to a soldier whose entire framework for evaluating the legitimacy of an argument had been constructed around the God Emperor's authority. What mattered was finding, in the space of whatever exchange happened in the second intercept chamber, the specific argument that would reach past Praxt's conditioning to whatever was underneath it. Karen had said, he needs to recognize genuine commitment. Worf had spent the 23 minutes of fast movement thinking about what that meant in operational terms, and he had arrived at an answer that he found simultaneously clarifying and uncomfortable, which in his experience was the reliable signature of a correct answer. It meant that the argument could not be made with words. Words were what Sardaukar officers were trained to parse for the gap between stated position and actual intention. The God Emperor's court had apparently been a sophisticated enough political environment that Sardaukar had developed, over generations, a finely calibrated sensitivity to the difference between what someone said and what they meant, because in that court the difference was frequently lethal. An argument made in words, however well constructed, would be filtered through that sensitivity and found insufficient. The argument had to be made with the fact of their presence. Karen had said this and Worf had heard it but not fully understood it until the 23rd minute of movement through volcanic tunnels, when the understanding arrived with the specific clarity that came from having no time left to approach it gradually. They were the argument. A Klingon officer and a Sardaukar Colonel-Bashar, moving together through the dark beneath the Klingon capital, was a statement that no amount of words could make more effectively. Either Praxt could read that statement or he could not. Either the training that made Sardaukar sensitive to genuine commitment extended to recognizing it in forms it had never encountered before, or it did not. They reached the second intercept chamber with 11 minutes to spare. It was larger than the map had suggested, the three-dimensional rendering had compressed the ceiling height, and the actual space had a cathedral quality to it, the basalt walls rising 6 meters to a vaulted roof where mineral deposits caught the light of their equipment and threw it back in dull orange constellations. 3 tunnel mouths opened onto the chamber floor. Steam rose from a fissure along the eastern wall. The space smelled of sulfur and ancient heat and the particular mineral sharpness of rock that had been molten within geological memory. They positioned themselves in the chamber's center. Worf's team arranged themselves without instruction, Koth reading the space and deploying his warriors across the 3 tunnel mouths with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that his job right now was to be present without being threatening, which was a specific and difficult skill. Karen stood beside Worf, slightly forward, which was a positioning choice that Worf noted, the Colonel-Bashar placing himself between his counterpart and whatever came through the tunnels, which was not a protective gesture in the conventional sense but a statement of relative authority in the encounter to come. Praxt's unit came through the northern tunnel at the 9-minute mark. They filled the tunnel mouth with the controlled efficiency of soldiers who had been briefed on the chamber's dimensions and had a plan for it, and the plan paused, physically, visibly, the entire column stopping with the precision of a mechanism encountering an unexpected input, when the lead elements processed what was in the chamber. Praxt himself emerged at the column's head. He was shorter than Worf had expected, compactly built, with the specific physical quality of someone whose strength was entirely functional with no dimension of display to it. His face was the face of a man who had processed a very large number of situations in which he was the most dangerous thing present, and who was now running a rapid and visible reassessment of whether that was currently true. He looked at Worf. He looked at Karen. He looked at the arrangement of the chamber, the 6 Klingon warriors at the tunnel mouths, positioned to observe rather than to block. He looked back at Karen. He spoke. The translator worked for 3 seconds. Colonel Bashar. This is not expected. No, Karen said. It is not. The Burseg's order is not rescinded, Karen said, and Worf heard the precision of the phrasing and understood it. He was not countermanding Shira's authority. He was creating space beside it. I am telling you that the circumstances which generated the order have materially changed. I am asking you to assess the change and apply your own judgment. Praxt's eyes moved to Worf. They stayed there for a moment that was longer than comfortable but shorter than hostile. You are the one who has been talking to the Colonel Bashar, he said through the translator. Yes, Worf said. You came into these tunnels. Yes. Knowing we were here. Yes. Praxt was quiet. The 80 soldiers behind him had not moved, had not shifted position or altered their weapons posture, because they were Sardaukar and they waited for the appropriate signal. The chamber held all of this. The 86 soldiers, the 6 Klingon warriors, the steam from the eastern fissure, the orange constellations on the ceiling, the weight of 3 hours and the weight of everything that had been said and not said across 5 days of negotiation, in a stillness that Worf recognized as the specific stillness that preceded either violence or its opposite, and could not yet determine which. The Burseg believes the negotiation has failed, Praxt said, to Karen. The Burseg made that assessment before this man came into these tunnels, Karen said. He did not look at Worf. He kept his eyes on Praxt. Assess what you see. Not what you were told you would see. The silence stretched to 15 seconds. Worf stood in it without moving, because movement would be interference and this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to Praxt, who was looking at his Colonel Bashar and at the Klingon officer standing beside him in the dark beneath the enemy's capital, and who was doing with that image what Sardaukar had apparently been built, somewhere in their deep training, to do with demonstrations of genuine commitment. Praxt turned to the soldier immediately behind him. He spoke 4 words. The translator rendered 2 of them with confidence. The other 2 it flagged as contextually ambiguous, carrying possible meanings ranging from hold position to stand down to something in between that the translator's linguistic database did not have a clean equivalent for. The column stopped advancing. Praxt looked at Karen. I will suspend the operation pending your formal order, he said carefully, through the translator's approximation. Pending. Not terminated. Suspended. The Burseg's authority is respected, Karen said. I am not asking you to override her. I am asking you to wait. Another silence. Shorter this time, because the essential decision had already been made and what remained was the formality of stating it. I will wait, Praxt said. Worf opened his communicator. His hand was steady, which required a specific and deliberate act of will that he did not allow to show. He called Martok. The operation is suspended, he said. The relay station is secure. I need you to extend the assault window by another 12 hours and I need a transport for 2 to the first city. Martok was quiet for 2 seconds. 2, he said. Myself and Colonel-Bashar Zoomkaren, Worf said. He is coming to meet Gowron in person. It is time to end this at the level where it should have been ended from the beginning. Above them, 3 kilometers of Qo'noS's volcanic crust separated the geothermal chamber from the first city, where a chronometer was running and a Chancellor was waiting and the High Council was assembling for what it expected to be a vote to authorize the destruction of everything that had landed in the Kor'vakh basin. What none of them knew yet, except Martok, was that the most dangerous man in the basin was currently standing in a tunnel beneath their feet, and had just agreed to wait. Gowron had not expected to meet the Colonel-Bashar in person. This was evident in the 40 seconds of absolute stillness that preceded his response when Worf walked into the Chancellor's private receiving room with Zoomkaren at his side. A stillness that was not Gowron's usual calculated pause but the genuine, unmediated reaction of a man encountering something that his political instincts had not prepared a response for. He stood behind the stone table and looked at the Sardaukar commander with the wide, intense eyes that were his most recognizable feature, and Zoomkaren looked back at him with the flat, assessing regard that was his, and the two of them occupied the same space for the first time with a quality of mutual recognition that needed no translation. Worf stood to the side and said nothing, because his role in this room was finished. He had carried the negotiation to this point through 5 days of volcanic terrain and geothermal tunnels and High Council chambers and a philosophical argument conducted in the dark beneath the Klingon capital, and what happened now was between these two men, and interfering with it would be the specific kind of mistake that undid everything that had made it possible. Gowron spoke first, because Gowron always spoke first, but what he said was not what Worf had expected. He did not issue a demand. He did not perform the Chancellor's authority. He said, in the direct and unadorned Klingon that he reserved for moments when the performance had run out of usefulness, "You came here." "Yes," Zoomkaren said, through the translator. "Into my city. My house." Gowron gestured at the walls with a brevity that encompassed the first city, the Empire, the 6 centuries of history embedded in this stone. "Of your own choice." "Of my own choice," Zoomkaren confirmed. Gowron looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something that Worf had seen him do perhaps 3 times in all the years of their fractious association. He sat down without the deliberate staging that usually accompanied his movements, and he gestured at the chair across the table with the blunt, unadorned hospitality of a man who had decided to stop performing. "Sit," he said. "Both of you. I want to hear this from the beginning." What followed was 3 hours. Worf had sat through many long conversations in the service of outcomes that required patience to reach, and he had developed over those years a quality of sustained attention that did not require the conversation to be continuously riveting in order to remain present to it. This conversation did not require that quality. It riveted him from the opening exchange and did not release him for 3 hours, because what was happening across the stone table was not negotiation in the conventional sense, not the managed exchange of positions between parties who had predetermined their limits. It was something more like 2 very different kinds of intelligence encountering each other directly for the first time and discovering, with the particular surprise that genuine discovery always carries, that the encounter was productive in ways neither had anticipated. Gowron asked questions that Worf had not heard him ask before, not the political questions of a chancellor establishing leverage but the direct questions of a warrior trying to understand something that interested him. He asked about Solusa Secundus, and listened to Zoomkaren's description of the prison planet with an attention that carried, underneath its political surface, something that looked like professional respect. He asked about the God Emperor, and the nature of absolute authority, and what it produced in the people who served it, and Zoomkaren answered with a candor that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask those questions in a context where the answer did not need to serve a predetermined political function. Zoomkaren asked his own questions. He asked about the Dominion War and what it had cost the Empire and how the Empire had survived it. He asked about the High Council. Its structure, its conflicts, its relationship to the Chancellor's authority. He asked, at one point, a question that the translator rendered with the uncertainty flag that indicated cultural compression. He asked what Klingon warriors believed happened after death. Gowron told him about Estiovokor with the particular quality of a man describing something he genuinely believed, which was different from the quality of a man describing something he was required to assert. The afterlife of the honored dead. The barge of the dead. The idea that a warrior's death was not the end of their service but the beginning of a different kind. Zoomkaren listened to this with complete attention and said nothing for a long moment afterward, and what moved across his face during that silence was something that Worf could not name precisely but that he recognized. It was the expression of a person encountering a framework that addressed something they had not known they were carrying. Sardaukar did not have an afterlife theology. They had a purpose theology, the God Emperor's vision, the service of that vision, the meaning derived from being the instrument of something greater. Remove the Emperor from the equation and you did not remove the need for meaning. You removed the structure that had been providing it and left the need exposed. Zoomkaren had been managing that exposure in himself and in his soldiers for 5 days, and here was Gowron of all people, across a stone table in a room with one batleth on the wall, offering a framework that did not require an emperor because it had already accounted for his absence. Warriors who die well are remembered. Their deeds persist. The meaning is not in the authority above them but in the quality of what they did and how they did it. Worf watched Zoomkaren absorb this and thought about the 40 minutes in the Kor'vakh basin when the Colonel-Bashar had talked about the God Emperor's purpose as the enforcement of coherence, the prevention of a galaxy consuming itself. He thought about the tunnel chamber and Praxt's face when he had looked at the two of them standing together and done the calculation that no amount of words could have produced. He thought about Shira in Terahong, who had followed the logic of everything she had been built to follow, and who was the remaining piece of a problem that was beginning, slowly, to assemble itself into something that had a shape. The shape emerged in the final hour of the 3-hour conversation, and it emerged from Gowron rather than from Worf, which was both a surprise and the most natural possible outcome of everything that had preceded it. Gowron, having sat across from Zoomkaren for 2 hours and assessed him with the particular intelligence that had kept him alive in Klingon politics for 15 years, arrived at a position that he framed not as a diplomatic compromise but as a military proposition, because it was a military proposition, and framing it correctly was the difference between the High Council accepting it and tearing it apart. The Sardaukar in the Kor'vakh basin would relocate. Not surrender, not disarm, relocate, to a designated position outside the first city's strategic perimeter, under terms that allowed them to maintain their unit integrity and their weapons while establishing a formal boundary that the Klingon Defense Force could present to the Council as a security achievement. Shira's force in Terahong would withdraw under a face-saving protocol. Not a retreat, but a redeployment to the consolidated position, framed as a tactical consolidation at the Colonel-Bashar's order rather than a capitulation to Klingon pressure. The dilithium facility would be returned to Klingon administration, and in exchange the Sardaukar would receive resupply from Klingon stocks, not unlimited, not unconditional, but sufficient to extend their operational timeline while a longer-term arrangement was worked out. The longer-term arrangement was the part that Gowron did not present to the High Council in full detail, because some things were more useful as facts on the ground than as Council debates. What he told the Council was that the Sardaukar had agreed to a containment framework and that Klingon honor had been satisfied. What was actually agreed, across the stone table in the private receiving room with Worf as the only witness, was that 8,000 soldiers without a home and without a way back to their own universe would, pending the development of a framework acceptable to both parties, operate as a special unit attached to the Klingon Defense Force's Frontier Command, assigned to the border regions where the Defense Force's resources were thinnest and the threats were least predictable. The Sardaukar would not become Klingon. Zoomkaren was explicit about this and Gowron accepted it with the pragmatism of a man who had not expected them to. They would not take oaths of loyalty or subordinate their command structure to Klingon hierarchy. They would operate as an allied force under a joint command protocol that gave Zoomkaren authority over his soldiers and gave the Defense Force's frontier commander the ability to assign operational objectives. They would be paid, in the sense of being supplied. They would be free, in the sense of retaining their identity. And they would be useful, in the sense that the frontier regions of the Klingon Empire were full of problems that 8,000 Sardaukar were uniquely equipped to solve. The hardest part was Shira. Karen had communicated the framework to her in full before the 3-hour conversation ended, and her response had arrived while Gowron was still in the room, which meant both men heard it simultaneously through the translator. It was not an immediate acceptance. It was a series of questions. Precise, tactical, operational questions about the terms of the withdrawal protocol and the structure of the Joint Command Arrangement, asked with the thoroughness of a senior officer evaluating whether a proposed framework would actually function or whether it was a diplomatic fiction designed to achieve her force's disarmament through procedure rather than combat. She asked about resupply chains. She asked about operational autonomy. She asked about what happened if the Joint Command Protocol produced orders that conflicted with Sardaukar doctrine. Karen answered each question with the same clarity he had brought to every exchange across 5 days of negotiation, and Worf watched Gowron listen to the exchange and recognized, in the Chancellor's expression, something that he had not expected to see there, the specific quality of respect that Klingon reserved for opponents who fought well. Shira had taken a colony world with 1,200 soldiers and held it against the implicit threat of the Empire's full response capability, and she had done it cleanly, without harming civilians, with a strategic logic that was coherent and a professional conduct that was, by any measure, admirable. Gowron could recognize that. It did not require him to be happy about Terahong to recognize it. Shira's final question came through the translator with the 91% confidence flag that indicated the translator had reached a new accuracy threshold on the language, which meant that for the first time in 5 days, Worf was hearing something close to exactly what a Sardaukar officer actually meant. The question was this. If the Klingon Empire found itself at war with a force that threatened its survival, would the Joint Command Protocol require Sardaukar participation in that defense? Gowron looked at the communicator. He looked at Karen. He said, in Klingon that the translator rendered for Karen in real time, if the Empire fights for its survival, every soldier under its banner fights. That is not a requirement. That is what it means to be under the banner. The silence on the transmission lasted 11 seconds. Then Shira said yes. The withdrawal from Terahong began 4 hours later, conducted with the same precision as the original assault, not the disordered retreat of a force that had been defeated but the deliberate redeployment of a force that had received new orders and was executing them with full professional fidelity. The Klingon response force that had been holding perimeter around the colony watched the Sardaukar landers lift with expressions that Koth, who filed the only ground-level report, described as complicated. In the Kor'vakh basin, the relocation of the main Sardaukar contingent was completed in 6 hours. The new position, designated jointly by Defense Force Cartography and Karen's own assessment, was in the Highland Plateau north of the basin, defensible terrain, sufficient space, geologically stable and free of the geothermal tunnel network that had produced 5 days of considerable anxiety for everyone involved. The Sardaukar moved into it with the same geometric precision they brought to everything, and by the time the Klingon sun set on the 6th day since the Heighliner had torn the sky open above Qo'noS, the position looked less like an invasion beachhead and more like something that did not yet have a name in Klingon military vocabulary because it had never existed before. Worf stood at the edge of the plateau as the light changed and watched the Sardaukar camp take shape below and thought about what Karen had said in the tunnel chamber, in the dark, before Praxt had arrived. That a soldier trained to enforce order should be able to recognize, if the argument is made correctly, that what order requires changes when circumstances change. He thought about the God Emperor's Court and Salusa Secundus and the orange haze still faintly visible in the upper atmosphere above Qo'noS, the last trace of a universe that was 3 days gone and might as well be infinite in its distance. He thought about Gowron saying under the banner and Shira saying yes and what it meant that both of those things had happened in the same conversation. He did not know if it would hold. Alliances built quickly under pressure had a history of fracturing when the pressure changed form, and the pressure here would change form constantly. The High Council's political objections, the Defense Force's institutional resistance to foreign soldiers in its command structure, The Sardaukar's own identity crisis as the months extended and the reality of permanent displacement settled into something that could not be managed by tactical focus alone. There were 100 ways this fragile framework could come apart, and Worf was a realistic enough man to hold all of them in mind while also holding the fact that it had not come apart yet, and that not coming apart yet was the only foundation any alliance ever started with. Zoom Karen appeared beside him without announcing himself, which Worf had stopped being surprised by. The Colonel-Bashar stood at the plateau's edge and looked at the same view with an expression that was the most openly contemplative Worf had seen on him across 6 days of extraordinary encounters. "Your Chancellor," Zoom Karen said. "He is more intelligent than he performs." "Yes," Worf said. "It is a useful quality in a political environment." "It has kept him alive for 15 years, Worf said. "Which in Klingon politics is the primary performance metric." Zoom Karen was quiet for a moment. "My soldiers will adapt," he said, and it was not a prediction or a reassurance. It was the statement of a man who had looked at an impossible situation and identified the one thing about it he was certain of. They are built to adapt to what kills them. This, he looked at the plateau, the camp, the Klingon sky above it, is not killing them. It is unfamiliar. Unfamiliar is not the same thing. No, Worf agreed. It is not. Below them, in the last light of the Klingon day, Sardaukar soldiers moved through their positions with the precision that had broken 3 Klingon battalions and stopped short of breaking everything else. In the first city, Gowron was presenting a version of events to the High Council that was politically navigable and strategically sound and omitted several details that would have made both things impossible. In Terahong, 11,000 civilians were emerging from confinement to find their colony intact, their garrison gone, and a laconic message from the Defense Force informing them that the situation had been resolved and that further details would be provided when they were available. On Deep Space Nine, Martok was reading Worf's preliminary report with an expression that those who knew him would have recognized as the expression he wore when he had been surprised by an outcome and was experiencing that surprise as something adjacent to satisfaction. The last light left the plateau. The Sardaukar camp's perimeter illumination activated. Amber lights arranged in the geometric pattern that was apparently the Sardaukar default for any perimeter in any location, a continuity of form across the incomprehensible distance of a dimensional breach. Worf watched the amber lights come on and thought that there was something almost beautiful about the stubbornness of that, the refusal to let the unfamiliarity of the ground change the standards applied to standing on it. He thought he understood, finally, what Zoom Karen had meant when he said they are built from the same thing we are built from. Not genetics. Not training. The thing underneath both, the decision, made so deep it could no longer be called a decision, to meet whatever came with full capacity rather than diminished expectation. To be, completely and without reservation, what you were, even when what you were had been dropped without warning into a world that had no category for you. It was, Worf thought, a very Klingon quality. He was not sure what to do with that observation yet. He suspected it would take longer than 6 days to find out. In the end, the sky above Qo'noS healed. The dimensional scar faded over weeks, leaving only the faint orange atmospheric haze that Klingon meteorologists eventually stopped trying to explain and began instead to name, the foldlight, in the old warrior poet tradition of marking things that could not be understood by making them beautiful instead. The Sardaukar remained. Not as conquerors, not as prisoners, not quite as allies in any framework the High Council's precedent library contained. They remained as themselves, 8,000 soldiers from a dead emperor's court, standing their watches in amber light on a highland plateau that had been volcanic rock 6 days before they arrived. Zoom Karen and Worf met twice more before Worf returned to Deep Space Nine. Once formally, to sign the Joint Command Protocol in a ceremony that both governments kept deliberately brief, and once informally, at the edge of the plateau at dusk, where they stood in the manner of two people who have been through something together and find that they do not need to talk about it in order to be aware of it. Shira arrived on the 7th day after Terahong, leading her 1200 back to the consolidated position with the bearing of a senior officer completing an ordered redeployment, which was exactly what she was doing, and she and Worf exchanged exactly 4 words across the entire duration of her arrival, which were, "You kept your word." He said yes. She nodded once and moved on, which was, he suspected, as close to a formal acknowledgement as her operational vocabulary permitted. What the galaxy made of the Sardaukar in the months that followed was a question that would take longer than any of them had to answer. What the Sardaukar made of the galaxy was already visible in the smaller signs. In Prax's unit adopting a Klingon patrol pattern that made their movement more efficient in highland terrain, in 3 Sardaukar soldiers who had begun, without apparent instruction, learning to speak Tl'Ingen whole from a defense force corporal who had been assigned as a liaison and had not expected to be treated as anything other than a watchdog, in the way the amber perimeter lights of the Highland camp became, over time, a landmark that the first city's inhabitants navigated by, the way you navigate by anything that has decided to stay. The Heighliner's wreckage continued to orbit Qo'noS in a slow, decaying path that the Defense Force's engineering corps was already discussing how to retrieve. The spice-saturated atmosphere fragments that had drifted down through the ionosphere were being analyzed in 17 different laboratories across the Empire, and the preliminary findings were the kind that made scientists describe things as extraordinary in the particular tone that meant they had not yet decided whether extraordinary was good or bad. The dimensional breach had closed completely on the 4th day and left no residual signature that Klingon or Federation sensor technology could detect, which meant there was no map home for 8,000 soldiers, and no map in for whatever else their universe might eventually decide to send. That last possibility kept several people awake at night. Worf was one of them. He suspected Zoomkaren was another. May the Force be with you. More stories await.